And
so welcome to Thirsters.
looks good, so I can see everybody else.
Glad folks are here because I think we have a really good presentation tonight. Peter Miller is going to introduce the presentation and also introduce the presenters from California and from Oregon. But I just want to say that please hold your questions and comments until after the presentation has been completed. And then once that has occurred, we're going to be asking questions about the work of the California Commission before we get to the work of the League of Women Voters in Oregon and Oregon Common Cause. That said, if you want to submit a question via Zoom chat, you're welcome to do that. And then we'll, as we have in the past, prioritize those questions, starting with the ones related to California, and then get to the ones in Oregon, and then have a general discussion after that. So with that, I will turn it over to Peter, who will introduce the topic and the presenters. Peter?
Hi, I'm Peter Miller. I'm a longtime thirster. I got interested in actually dealing with the redistricting issue last January of 2019, when I went to a national conference hosted by Common Cause at Duke University in North Carolina, because North Carolina was a particularly happening place in terms of redistricting at that time. And I've been interested since, and I've been volunteering with Common Cause on other issues, but including this. And Common Cause is, which, as Christina will explain, is getting very much involved in bringing that issue up for the referendum in November in Oregon. We'll see how that goes. Later on, what that consists of. A question about that might be asked is why is this important in Oregon? And that goes back to sort of what gerrymandering is and isn't. Gerrymandering was a term invented in 1812 by a fellow named Governor Gerry of Massachusetts, who managed to create a map of Massachusetts that guaranteed that his party would be elected in one of those districts. A reporter identified as looking like a salamander, so he called it a gerrymander, and that term has stuck now for over 2 centuries. And so it usually gets associated with a gross manipulation of districts in order to benefit a particular party. And that hasn't historically applied very strongly in Oregon. But what has and does apply is efforts by by incumbents to get together in the legislature when the redistricting is carried out by the legislature. Incumbents can get together and parse out the districts in such a way that Republican or Democrat, they're basically safe. So for the voters, there really isn't much reason to vote. You know which party is going to win in your district because it's been set up that way. And that's a more serious problem very much in Oregon. It also is relevant to how a district is defined in terms of community, in terms of what kinds of people are in a particular district. So there has been, in 2010, there was a good deal of gross gerrymandering at a national level mostly but not entirely by the but that the results of that have gotten a good deal more public involvement than there had been before, and one result was that a Citizens Commission for redistricting was established in California, and that has been since regarded as a kind of gold standard. Here's how you do it, and we're fortunate that Common Cause, through Christina Nieves, who I'll introduce in a second, has brought 4 commissioners from that California commission to talk to us about what their experience was and what the issue is. They've given these presentations elsewhere around the country, and now we have the good fortune to have it for us. So in order to introduce them individually, I'd like to hand the mic over to Christina Nieves, who is Associate Director of Common Cause in Oregon. Christina?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, thanks, Peter. So yes, as Peter said, can everyone hear me? Okay. Okay. Yes. So as Peter said, yeah, I'm the Associate Director of Common Cause Oregon. And right now, Common Cause Oregon and Common Cause National is really working to make sure that district lines, when we have an opportunity to redraw them, are drawn fairly. Right now, as you know, legislators are at the forefront of that decision making, and that's an issue. Places like Ohio, Michigan, and of course California have already had successful redistricting reforms come into play. And so that's one of our major part of our campaign is the education and information sharing. Many people don't even know this is an issue. Many people don't understand why this is an issue for Oregon, as Peter was referencing. But what the California commissioners are here to talk about is really the value of redistricting reform and the experience that they had and the impact that it had on their communities. For our campaign specifically right now, we're working on gathering signatures to get this on the ballot so that voters actually have the opportunity to weigh in to end gerrymandering in Oregon. And we'll talk more about that towards the end of the presentation. Other organizations that we're partnering with, like the League of Women Voters, Norman Terrell is here, really truly believe that this is the right time and this is the right thing to do for Oregon. So with that, I'll hand it off to Norman Terrell from the League of Women Voters.
Thank you, Christina. Maybe I should say a few words about
Norman?
myself. I've actually been a League member since the 1970s sometimes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yep,
Yes.
we're good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hear you.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
we're
I
good.
don't see you.
All right. So
Yes.
I was saying that I've actually been a League member since the 1970s, sometime when the League first invited men to be members, and I've been a member ever since. But I was actually more interested in Common Cause in Seattle, where I was living, and at one point became president of the Common Cause organization in Washington State. But maybe more important for this discussion is that I've actually helped lobby the Washington legislature for a independent redistricting commission back in the early 80s. They were having the same sort of problems in Washington State as Oregon does, that they had trouble passing any sort of redistricting program, and often it got failed over to the courts. In Oregon, it fails over to the Secretary of State, and it's done that many times. In fact, the City Club of Portland actually did a study and showed that over 100 years, they've actually failed all but maybe once. And that was in 2011, and it is touted as being a huge success. But if you look at the details, it's actually created a more safe districts than were before. So that's the kind of problem that we're actually trying to compact to act against. And anyway, I went on to become a national board member of the League of Women Voters, and actually helped organize the small coalition about redistricting in Oregon about 4 years ago. And about a year or more ago, we decided we needed to push this onto the ballot with an initiative. The legislature would be unlikely to do this. And so I and Common Cause and a few others organized the coalition that we're now calling the People Not Politicians. So we'll talk more about that later. The important thing is that you learn about redistricting, how it worked in California. Our proposal is modeled on what they did in California with a few tweaks, adjusting for the Oregon context. And so we'll maybe talk about a little bit about the differences later, but it's more important to hear from the California commissioners first. So who do you want me to introduce from now on, Christina? You're muted.
Yeah, let's go ahead and have the California commissioners introduce themselves, and then Jean, if you want to jump into the presentation with the order that you've chosen.
Okay, well, I'm on the top of the screen here, so I'll go first. My name is Jean Raya. Thank you so much for having us this evening. I live in Los Angeles County. I'm a small business owner, and I am a registered Democrat. And I'll turn it to Gil.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Gil Ontai, and I'm from San Diego, Southern California, and I'm the registered Republican member.
Go ahead, Connie.
Gavino?
Okay. Ever the gentleman. I knew that you were going to be looking to me, Gavino.
Go ahead, Connie.
I'm Connie Malloy, and I am in Pasadena, right near the Rose Bowl. And I am a registered independent voter, no party preference.
And I'm Dr. Gabino Aguirre. I'm from a small town in Ventura County, California, Santa Paula. I'm a retired educator, presently working with the census campaign out of the Ventura County Community Foundation. Mr. Democrat.
Okay, so Christina, are we able to start the slides? Or how do you want to do that? And while you're bringing it up, I just want to thank you again for inviting us. And it's a pleasure for us to be with you. We wish we could be there in person. Had all these circumstances not intervened. But we're glad that we can do this. We're able to do all of this interaction with other states that are looking to do redistricting reform because we received a $100,000 grant from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government for innovation in governance and the public engagement. So that's enabled us to travel to a number of states, and I can give you a quick rundown. Colorado, Utah, Texas, Arizona, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Michigan, New Jersey, North Carolina, Georgia, Maryland, Virginia, as well as conferences in Nashville and Chicago. And if anybody, the commissioners, think of something I've missed, you can fill it in. The applications for this first California Commission were just off the charts. It took a while to get there, but out of the 35,000 people, winnowed down to the 14 who are 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 who have no party preference. And we have a picture of the commission, which I hope everyone can see, because I think it really is a reflection of California. you have everybody. We were aged about 30 to 70-ish when we started out, and represent every major ethnic group in the state of California as well as geography. The effort having been to create a balanced commission out of the first 8 who were the lucky 8, chosen by bingo balls. And then we in turn selected the last 6 in order to achieve some balance. And other commissioners will give you more detail on that. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Connie, I believe is up first.
John, you have disabled my ability to share my screen. So I can't share my screen. It might be better if you, at this point, if you are the one to slide through the slides, unless you can quickly have me as the co-host.
I'll just pause here to see if we can get our slides up and running.
Yeah.
John, can you hear us?
I think John is muted.
Yes, I can hear you. And Christina, you're a co-host now.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, let's try this. Boom. Okay, let's see. Share. And there we are.
Okay. So
let me start at the beginning. Sorry. Work in progress. Okay.
It's nice to know I'm not the only one that struggles with this thing.
So are we on to the next slide?
The next slide is the picture of the commission. Yeah. And
Yes.
I'll let Connie take it.
Sure.
There's Connie right in front.
So I'll just add into what Jeannie shared, which is, this is our commission very early on in our process. We're now at about year 9.5 of a 10-year term. So you're catching us on just the tail end. By July, we will no longer have commissioner next to our names, although I think once a redistricting buff, you're always a redistricting buff, whether you have the title or not. There's a number of traits that I think we really shared across the commission that were critical for our shared success, and the ability to be impartial was really one of them. As you heard, we all have a registered party. We, all come with our lens on life based on like all of those things, but this commitment to the task at hand and being able to truly share our point of view, not be wallflowers, but at the same time be willing to change our point of view and to learn and to grow through the process that is really a collective one. There were, amongst my colleagues on the commission, there were just a range of relevant skills, both analytical, practical, because of the mix of different professions, educational backgrounds, etc. We really were able to complement each other well. We had a number of people who had experience working in, nonprofit organizations or running a small business, providing consulting services. We had a farmer, we had a bookstore owner, educator, etc. And really the goal was to be able to reflect California, but also to be able to shape and add substantively to the task at hand. We were really lean operation by design, and so we did have a basic team of staff, but there were a lot of things that we didn't have staff for and we didn't have budget for, and so as commissioners we all pitched in. And it was also really important that we had a familiarity with California. And so for some commissioners, some of us had lived and worked in various parts of the state. Others had been kind of born and bred in a particular region and knew that region well. And so, wanted to bring all of those perspectives to bear. And I think in Oregon, it will be very important as well to have, again, this impartiality, the analytical skills, and a deep commitment to and appreciation for everything that makes Oregon so great. I think we can go on to the next slide. And, a question that one might ask and that you will probably face as you have conversations with your neighbors around the referendum is, how do we know that Oregon needs redistricting reform? So here's some rules of thumb that we have found very ironic. One is cities are split into multiple districts, and there may be good reason here and there to split a city, but if you find that consistently your cities are split into multiple districts, something might be wrong there. Communities have no voice, so legislators really have no motivation to return your call or anyone in your community's call because they don't feel accountable. They know that their district is safe. As electeds, they've been able to negotiate with other electeds or hire consultants to be able to draw them safe seats, and thus they're really not in the running. They feel that that seat is actually something that they own versus something that belongs to the public good. And lastly, your grandfather voted for your representative. And, despite the dry humor that we all bring to this process, the reality is these types of dynamics have a major impact on the quality of our lives in our communities. And so we're here and in all these other states that Jeannie talked about to spread the message that there really is a better way. Just because this has been the status quo does not mean that it has to continue. And we felt like our job in California was to test it out and then share with you what we thought worked and what maybe you can even do better in Oregon than we were able to do in California. We'll go to the next slide. So, one of the considerations I mentioned, cities being split. Cities are certainly an important part of the equation. There's also a number of other types of communities whose boundaries might not be as concrete as cities, where we can, look at a map and define exactly what streets hold that community together. But there's other types of communities that are geographically connected, and they may have something in common that's really important. It can be something that is an economic tie that they hold or a social tie that they hold. And keeping those communities together for purposes of political representation can be just as important as keeping a city together. I'll give you a couple of examples. In California, we're famous for our wine, and one of the areas that we went to was the Napa Valley area, and how much we got an earful from folks that were part of that industry saying that in some sets of maps in the past that you would have grape growers that were separated from all of the processing and distribution facilities related to the wine industry, even though they really were operating as one unit and had a number of concerns that they needed their representatives to be able to address, whether those were water rights, transportation infrastructure, taxes, etc. Another part of the state by the Salton Sea is essentially a Superfund site. It's a cleanup area, and in previous rounds of redistricting, they had sometimes been split up, which made it very difficult dealing with some of the federal resources that they have been requesting and managing in that area. So a community of interest can take many different forms that are really important to hear about and for as commissioners to be paying attention to as you then go to the task of drawing the lines. And we can just kind of run through, I think there's a couple more bullets and can get on with the next slide. Yeah, we'll go to the next slide, which is the for success.
Yeah.
Great. This image is slaying the dragon, much like there was the gerrymander, the salamander type shape. There's the infamous districts that look like dragons. And so we ask ourselves, well, how do you slay the dragon? How do you ensure that Oregon is able to draw reasonable people-centered districts? And these are some of the ingredients that we found important in California. Really committed team. As commissioners, it's a hard job. It takes a lot of work. The stakes are high. You're really everyone in your legislature wants you to fail, and you feel that daily, right? They're not making your job easy or giving you any pats on the back. So you've really got to be focused on what is the mission that we all believe in, that we're here to accomplish, to get you through all of the many hurdles that will be along the way, both as commissioners and then as the staff team that you hire. We also were really blessed by having a number of organizers across the state who were having conversations with their neighbors. These aren't just paid folks that work for nonprofit organizations. They're just interested people who have an opinion about what constitutes fair representation, that we're going door to door. We're talking with people in their family about what is redistricting, because most people don't know what redistricting is. What is the purpose of the commission, and really helping to mobilize around giving testimony to the commission. We also had some generous donors that were part of helping raise the funds to actually qualify and get on the referendum that had to pass. And in our first round, the resources that the commission was provided to do our work were really bare bones. And so there were also a couple of foundations, one in particular, that helped to plug some of the implementation gaps. So for example, recruiting a diverse pool of commissioners, how to get the word out to communities that might not be inside the beltway, as we say. They might not already be kind of in the know about politics and about this particular commission opportunity. Donating meeting space. We didn't have a budget to rent a room everywhere we went across the state to hear from the people. And so oftentimes it would mean a nonprofit organization or a city, a community group lending us their space. So all kinds of ways to be able to kind of pitch in and make the effort a success. And then, in terms of the kind of persuasion and media partners, we had to create a new narrative that people could really own this process, that the districts actually belong to us, and that everyday people could have the capacity to draw these districts. I think there's a real misnomer out there that only legislators are smart enough or have the technical savvy to figure out how to draw a good district, and that's simply not the case. So to be able to have balanced, nonpartisan coverage in the media and education was really critical, so that we could focus on the work, because we just didn't have the capacity to hold the whole public education campaign that we might have thought was helpful as a parallel track. So with that, I'll pass it off to one of my colleagues.
I think that might be me. Was that you, Gil?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'll jump in. So, one of the things that we needed to do was to have clearly defined goals. And so as we met as a commission, then how many of us know how to draw maps? So how many of us know about state departments and how the bureaucracy works? So we had to, as Connie pointed out, we had to depend on each other's skill sets to make sure that we accomplish the mission. And one of the, I think, surprising things to me, not that I'm a diehard Democrat, I'm more of an issue-based kind of voter, but I thought that we were going to be struggling on a partisan basis, and that it was going to not go very smoothly. But to my surprise, I found that the selection process has really brought together a team that was largely nonpartisan, that was committed to the goal, and that was going to be able to do this. And as has been mentioned in some of the reports that have been done, we started out with hardly any direction at all, and very quickly, because of timelines, we found ourselves flying the plane while we were building and designing it at the same time. So if you look at that old map of this Congressional District 38, you'll see how disjointed it is. And the history of redistricting here in California is largely, I think, the history in every state in the union. And that is that, once you become an elected official there, you have an invested interest in remaining in that position of power. And as an elected representative myself in a local city, then there's some ego involved. And the fact that you are become a VIP in a given community, it kind of works on you, and you want to stay in that position, So I could only do 2 terms of that before I realized that I needed to move on, so I moved on. So next slide, please. All right, so the selection of the commission, it was a very, very transparent process. From the very beginning, because of the nature of politics itself and the history of politics here in California, and generally, is that there's a lot of backroom deals that go on, and the suspicion was that this was just going to be another group that was going to do that. And the fact that the legislature really had no real power in the selection or giving the direction of the commission itself really allowed us to be committed to be in the public eye, and for the public to see every little action, every little discussion that we had about redistricting in California. It was out front. All of our meetings were in public. We were prevented from talking to each other about commission business outside of those public meetings, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing was that each one of us was independent. With 35 million people in California and 14 of us representing those 35 million, then we had to be independent-minded. And once we learned about the redistricting process and what it was going to entail and the challenges that we were going to be facing, then we knew that we had to speak our voice, to express our to address. And we knew also that we were in a very high stakes game in hostile territory, being California, even in the state capital itself, knowing that we had no friends at the state capital. So as commissioners then, we represented the totality of the state's population. Next slide, please. So as far as collaboration was concerned, again, it had to be nonpartisan. So very quickly we realized that this continued gerrymandering was something that affected negatively not only the representation of people through their legislators, but also that it led to fiefdoms, where certain politicians created situations where they had controlled large amounts of power, so that really was provided a negative impact on the community as a whole, the whole of California. So we had to look at issues through a nonpartisan lens. And as I mentioned before, one of the beautiful things about the commission was that we all realized very quickly that we had a job to do and that we were there to fulfill that mission, and that although we were going to have differences of opinion, ultimately the mission was to provide access to the franchise for every single voter in California. So we started out by deciding who was going to be taking the leadership in this commission. And to begin with, there was an individual that was elected chair of the commission. But then once all of the commissioners were brought on, the initial, what we called the lucky 8 who were chosen by dingle balls, and then the other 6 who were called ourselves the chosen 8, we realized that that we had to work together. And so as far as the chairmanship was concerned, we decided that we were going to have shared leadership. And it was going to rotate through the whole commission. If a commissioner wanted to participate, then initially there were a few commissioners that did not want to participate. But anyway, so we had a rotation where it went from one individual from one party to the next individual to the other party to the next individual that was not independent, and then it rotated like that. So we also developed a committee structure because the workload was so heavy that that we saw that we needed to organize ourselves into teams. So we had developed a committee-based system, and we shared work and tasks. So we also agreed that there were times when we were going to disagree, and that we were going to be careful listeners, and that we were going to be as objective as we possibly could, and of course as nonpartisan as we possibly could. So next slide, please. So as far as public engagement is concerned, I think public engagement began when the proposition here in California, we have the initiative process, when Proposition 11 was put on the ballot, which created the commission that initially was to work with the state assembly, the state senate, and the Board of Equalization districts, as I understand. So Proposition 11 squeaked by 51% to 49%. Actually, it was much closer than that, but for the sake of presentation, 51 to 49. And then there was Prop 20 that came along, which added the congressional districts. And by then, I think that the public had become aware of the potential of redistricting presented. So on Prop 20, which was to include the congressional districts, that passed 61 to 39. And interestingly, at the same time, there was Proposition 47. No, Proposition, I remember, let's see, Prop 27, which was an effort to kill the commission before we even got started. And that lost 47 to 53. So as was just mentioned, when the word went out on redistricting through our partners, our CBO partners, and through the assistance of some nonprofit organizations and foundations, then there were 37,000 and change applicants. And as was just mentioned, 5 Republicans were ultimately chosen, 5 Democrats, and 4 independents, so to speak. And so we decided that one of the first questions that faced us as far as moving forward was, where do you start? In a state like Oregon, for example, where do you start? Do you start on the coast? Do you start on the interior? Do you start in the north? Do you start in the south? I mean, where do you start? And one of the suggestions was, well, why don't we look at what's there, take what's there, and then tweak it so that we can, it'll be easier to do like that. And as we pondered on that challenge, we decided that actually, because there were 4 counties that were under section that were in violation of the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, under Section 5, that because the redistricting, any changes in voting in those 4 counties had to go before the Department of Justice. It was decided that we were going to work on those areas which were primarily agricultural counties in Central California. So we started there, and then once we knocked those out, then we traveled to the north in Northern California and moved south. And as we moved south, we got past San Francisco, and we went all the way to just north of Los Angeles, and then we stopped in Ventura County, which is where I am, just north of Los Angeles. We skipped Los Angeles and we went down to San Diego, and then we started moving north. Understanding that the most complex, complicated, and challenging area to redistrict was going to be the LA metro area, which has 15, 20 million people in it. So that we were going to be traveling as a full commission. Or initially we thought, okay, with such a large state, with so many cities and areas to cover, we can perhaps develop into teams of 3, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, and 1 independent, and we can travel to different corners of the state, come back and report and move on. But we decided that actually we had to present a unified face to the commission. So we decided that we were going to go traveling throughout California as a full commission. We had a staff that, as Connie mentioned, worked to secure venues for us, primarily public spaces, colleges, libraries, etc. And so as we traveled around California then, we had 34 public hearings throughout California. And at those public hearings, individuals were given 3 minutes to state their case, to present their ideas on what would be the ideal district for their area, and to put forth their arguments. And so there were times when the lines were so long as we worked into the evening that we had to reduce the 3-minute public comment to 1 minute, and you would think that folks would just be discouraged and would just absolutely leave. And to our surprise, they hung on for that 1 minute presentation. They hung on and presented sometimes late into the night. So we had a total of 2,700 speakers that presented to us in public. We had a total of 34 public hearings. And then we had 70 meetings, business meetings, deliberation meetings. And when we had asked our public to give us their ideas by presenting their ideas either verbally or in writing, and we accumulated over 22,000 written submissions that came to us. All of our meetings were live streamed, they were videotaped, and minutes of those meetings were developed as quickly as we could get them developed by our staff, and we tried to get them on right away. So some of our meetings then, as we move forward with our agenda, then individuals would call in, or during public comment, people would line up to provide their information, their interest, and then we take some comments on the phone as well. So we try to be as transparent, as responsive as we possibly could. Next slide, please. So measures of success, maybe I can pass it on to Gil, to my brother Gil, to cover this area.
Okay. All right. So again, nice to meet everyone. So I'm Gil Ontai, and I'm the registered Republican member. And what I wanted to share with you how we measured success overall when we completed the maps. Number one, I would have to say, it's not on here, but I would have to say that the commissioners, all 14 of us, worked together very well. And it's through this mostly consensus process of determining district lines, producing a set of maps that California is now, in the latest poll, approve what we've done, I think is the greatest success of the commission. To do that, of course, as Gabino mentioned, we was a very transparent process. We had to go out to the community, and adding on to what Gabino said, we went through 2 cycles. The first cycle was, again, from Northern California down to San Diego, basically getting public input to draw the maps. We knew that that first set of maps would not be totally successful, and we heard a handful of complaints, hundreds of complaints actually, and we anticipated that to happen. But we learned from that mistake, and we improved those maps, and when we went through the second cycle, again, from Northern California down to San Diego, the maps were greatly improved, and we had overwhelming support for the second round of maps. So getting community input, voters' voice in that process was the key. And it was mentioned by the state Supreme Court when we were challenged by those maps, that is because we had such overwhelming public input in those maps that the court found our decision-making basically flawless. So it's important to get that community outreach and that transparency, because you're probably going to get some lawsuits, and that's going to be a big issue. You need a sound foundation on how you drew that maps, and it's got to come from the voters who come to these meetings. So it should represent their interests. You know, district competitiveness was not one of our criteria. It's not one of our ranked criteria. But the maps that we drew inadvertently, if you will, created some of the most competitive maps in the country. I'll talk to that about in the next couple of slides later on. I'll go back to that. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I'm having some issues with my computer here. Hold on. Let's see. Okay, next slide. There we go.
So this is just an example of how we met with the public to get input that was very necessary for us to validate our maps. This particular area is in the Los Angeles Basin area, but it is an example on the left of how a community, the Congressional District 38, was drawn previous to our maps. And as you can see, it's weird, but this was really a cracked, actually it's a packed district, and this is how they put Latinos in this configuration as much as possible, which diminished their representation in the other surrounding areas. So in our other map, which is shown to the right, we reconfigured this area here and created an overwhelming voice for the Latino community in this district to be represented. So it's an example of how we drew this as we went through all these underserved communities and gathered their input. But it was from this type of information, this public testimony, that allowed us to come back and to really draw lines during the second cycle, by the way, I should say, that truly represented the voices of underserved communities. So let me go to the next slide, please.
For some reason, it's not letting me click through, so let me try something real quick. Oh, man, slide 11. There we go.
There you go. So let's look at competitiveness. Although it's not one of our criteria, how competitive were our maps? Public Policy Institute of California pronounced that the 2011 CRC plan is more competitive than most of than 72% of the plans in other states. I should say also that Politico stated that the California maps is the most competitive in the entire union. You know, PBS NewsHour on October 10th of 17 stated that 80% of all maps in the United States are partisan drawn gerrymandered maps. So when you consider what California did, it really is a tremendous accomplishment for Californians. Now, you know, let me give a little story on how passionate I feel about the maps. I'm essentially a small business person. I ran a 20-person firm, an architectural firm in San Diego. Very active on the Planning Commission and in the Chamber of Commerce in San Diego. I chaired the school district's committee where we worked with school districts to try to get the curriculum up to speed, you know, so our kids can learn how to read and write and be productive in the workforce. At that time, this is 10 years ago, 11 years, 12 years ago, California was in such gridlock that we kept firing teachers and closing programs almost every year, sometimes twice a year. We were losing teachers. So as a chamber member working with school district, I could not figure out what was going on in Sacramento. This is puzzling. So I finally decided, actually I was challenged by my students at a college that I also taught, that if you want to do something, I would be telling them that if they want to make changes in their communities, they have to be engaged. So they turned around and said, well, if you feel so strongly about that, you should do it yourself. So I did that, threw my hat in it, and I decided that, you know, maybe the way to solve the gridlock that was happening in Sacramento was to get engaged on this commission to see how we can redraw the lines to break the gridlock, partisan gridlock in Sacramento, and make changes that are very meaningful to Californians. So I wanted to share that. Now, 9 years and 4 election cycles after our maps were completed, we now have a functioning Sacramento. We don't have gridlock. We've had a surplus every year since 2017. We've had the strength to meet our public funding obligations at the required legal levels. We've increased the job opportunities and job rates in California tremendously. But going back to the maps itself, prior to our maps, only 5 seats changed hands, party hands, out of the 765 legislative and congressional contests since before our maps. But after our maps, we had 57 new maps in California, roughly 38 new assembly maps, 38 new assembly members, 29 new senators, and 14 new congressional members. So all of this happened since we changed those district lines in California. So I just wanted to share that with you to give you the results of what happened in our maps and how competitive we are, not by design, but as the circumstances of our maps. So I'll end there. I think, Jeannie, you want to wrap it up with the Ash Grant? Or?
I don't think there's too much more I can say about the Ash Grant, except that we're hoping to be able to make use of the balance of our funds, perhaps even beyond July 5th, just because obviously the pandemic has thrown everything into disarray, and even though our grant should expire, I think that everybody would like to see us make the best use of those funds. So we may get to Oregon yet, but it was a tremendous gift to the commission. It was a lot of work. Actually, Gil's the one who found the grant and encouraged us to go after it. So again, we thank, the Harvard Kennedy School for helping us to do this. And I'll turn it back to, I think it's, I don't know, Christina or Norman, who's taking it now.
Yeah, so this next slide, which is what you just talked about. Norman, I think this is your part, talking about our campaign here in Oregon to bring redistricting reforms to reality, the People Not Politicians campaign. Norman, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christina. I want to lightly or quickly describe the proposal that we have, and then I want to talk about the redistricting initiative campaign that we have started in Oregon, and then we'll see if there's any questions. The initiative is a constitutional amendment, and so it's going to require 150,000 signatures, valid signatures. There are three major parts to the proposal. By the way, it has to be a constitutional amendment because the current process is embedded in the state constitution. So that's why it's a constitutional amendment. The proposal is, as I said earlier, modeled largely after what they did in California, with some adjustments for Oregon's context. So the three major parts of the proposal are, first, the choosing of the commission. The second part is the criteria that the commission uses and how it operates. Then the third big part is how the maps can be appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court as the final arbiter of the process. So to describe a little bit about the choosing of the commissioners, instead of 14 commissioners in California, we have chosen a somewhat smaller commission of 12 commissioners, and it would be evenly balanced between 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 4 other. The other can be either third parties or what we call non-affiliated voters in Oregon. And those are chosen in a very elaborate process that I won't go into a great deal of detail because we don't have time tonight, but I can say that it's quite similar to what California did so successfully already. The important part of that is that people who have conflicts of interest are excluded from the process. Anybody who's been a candidate or a public office holder or a political party officer or even big fund givers or donors to campaigns are excluded from the commission because they have in a conflict of interest in the process. The first step is to create a pool of 3 different pools of Democrats, Republicans, and non-affiliated. And from those pools, the first 6 commissioners are chosen randomly. And then those first 6 commissioners are chosen from the same 3 pools in order to balance and adjust the demographics of the commission to be at least somewhat representative of the state. So in California, the process is overseen by the nonpartisan state auditor. In Oregon, we don't have an auditor, and it's certainly not nonpartisan. So we've chosen to have the process overseen by 3 administrative law judges that are usually doing mediations and such between parties in the education department. But this is an agency of the state government, and they're supposed to be nonpartisan and judicious, and so we thought those would be the best thing for this process to be overseen. The second part of the process is the criteria and how the commission works. The criteria are actually very similar to what the state legislature is supposed to be using now, And you'll recognize some of these as being like equal population, that the districts have to be contiguous. They have to follow federal law, and particularly the Voting Rights Act. The districts have to follow geographic and political boundaries wherever possible. And the districts are supposed to also follow communities of interest wherever possible. And the only added criteria that we've proposed is one of competitiveness. We thought that was actually very important for the process. And we have some light definitions of communities of interest and competitiveness in the proposal. But this is a human process, and the commission is supposed to consider all these criteria together and balance out the different criteria in such a way that the voters win instead of the politicians. So the last, well, let me talk about the operation a little bit. All the operations of the commission have to be done in public. The commission chooses its own staff and could hire lawyers and such, and also experts on computer mapping and whatnot. And all that has to be done fairly quickly. The third big part of the proposal is that the maps that the commissioners propose by a certain deadline can be appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court. If anybody in the whole state thinks that the criteria weren't followed, then they can do that appeal, and then the court gets the final say on whether or not the criteria were followed. So that in very quick outline is the proposal. I want to describe the coalition a bit. It's actually a very broad politically coalition. Common Cause and the League of Women Voters of Oregon are the core of the proposal, but we've also brought in people like the Oregon Farm Bureau, the Taxpayer Association of Oregon, the AAUW, OSPRG, the Independent Party of Oregon, the Progressive Party of Oregon, and some others that I'm probably forgetting. But you can see that politically it covers the whole political spectrum.
Did you mention the NAACP, branches of the NAACP also?
I didn't do that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, There's many, so it's easy to forget.
There's quite a few chapters of the NAACP throughout the state, and they're part of the coalition as well. The signature gathering plan has been planned for months now. We actually started over a year ago doing some drafting of the proposal and organizing and gathering our coalition together. And only just yesterday did we actually announce that we're going ahead with the signature gathering in spite of the pandemic and other obstacles and the fact that we only have about 6 weeks left in the campaign. We have planned a three-prong program that we think can be successful in getting the 150,000 signatures that we need. The first part of the plan is to have a direct mail campaign to about 500,000 voters, or actually registered voter households. And each of those households might have multiple voters in them, and we're sending petitions directly to them. And hopefully they'll return those at a high rate, especially since they're locked down in quarantine at the moment. So they've got nothing else to do but look at our petition. Then the second part of the plan is a direct email campaign to as many people as we can get. We particularly will be going through the coalition members. We think there's about 100,000 constituents of our various coalition partners. And they will be asked to go to our website. You'll see the URL at the bottom of the screen here. If you go to that URL, you can find our petition, and you can download a one-signature version of the petition, sign it, and then mail it back to us. So that hopefully will get us a few tens of thousands of signatures. And then the final prong of the plan is that we think that the pandemic restrictions will be lifted sometime soon. The governor today announced some restrictions being lifted. But sometime between now and early June, we think we can actually get out onto the streets and do some traditional petitioning and even be paying some people together with volunteers to get more signatures again. This is a very popular idea in Oregon. Lots of people understand the dangers of gerrymandering and letting the legislature have its own way with their conflicts of interest. And so it's really a needed reform, and many people understand it.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Norman. I just wanted to mention one thing. We're Common Cause Oregon. I'm putting together a group of volunteers to reach out to our members and their networks to make sure that they have access to the link that's on this slide here, which I'll send in the chat or send an email. John, you can tell me which method you think is better. But if any of you are interested in joining this volunteer effort, to reach out to your networks and make sure that people understand the instructions of how they can still have their voice heard and still have democracy issues like redistricting put on the ballot, regardless of the pandemic. If you're interested in helping that effort, please let me know. I can send my contact information as well. Right now, we have about 13 core really dedicated Common Cause volunteers that are reaching out to our members, making sure that everybody understands how to get the printed petition correctly signed and turned in.
Great.
So one more point, and then I'll give it back to you. I pasted into the chat box, unfortunately garbled with the previous URL there, but I put a article from the Oregonian that was published yesterday that might help understand this process more. So I'm finished, I think. We'll see if there are questions.
Yes, well, let's give them presenters a round of applause.
Thanks, everyone.
Or a thumbs up, or a wink, or thank you.
Hold on. Bravo.
Like this.
That's
Okay.
better. Yeah.
Oh. So we have lots of different questions, and I'll go ahead and start with Peter Miller, who had a question about zip codes.
Yeah, I guess a year ago, last January, there was a paper presented at that Duke conference, which would be available, by the way, at the Common Cause National website, which concluded that zip codes, because of the way they're drawn up, make very useful community boundaries, not necessarily inviolable, but splitting up a zip code causes a considerable degree of disconnect between communities, and strongly recommended that you look carefully at avoiding splitting zip codes when those boundaries are drawn. Does the California Commission, does that relate to the Commission, to the experience of the California Commission?
Let me take that, and you guys can jump in as well. No, we did not take that into consideration. It is an interesting point. With today's technology, I think we might have given that consideration had we had those technical tools at that time. But it is just one criteria, one tool that we would have used. But the most important issue is to get that community input, because even zip codes, I'm going to have to disagree with Duke, doesn't necessarily define communities of interest. Only the public can tell you that through public testimony.
Yeah, I'll add to that in that our definition in the initiative really depends on the voters in that area to define their own community of interest, and let the commission know what their community of interest is, and that can be then balanced with the other criteria.
I guess if I could, it seems like in any region there are inevitably a lot of communities of interest. There's age, wealth, ethnicity, political affiliation, levels of education. There's inherently a lot. And it seems to me whoever decides which particular community of interest to group together, whoever has the status to get grouped together, whoever makes that decision determines what the winner of the next election is going to look like.
Well, you know, when we had testimony from the public, it was for the purpose of communities themselves defining themselves rather than the commission making. We didn't make any designs or decisions on our own. We did bring to bear our familiarity with different parts of the state. That's the beauty of having such a diverse commission. So if you have people coming to testify, you can apply a certain amount of maybe sometimes skepticism, sometimes affirmation based on the experience that, you know, that we had all had with different areas of the state. But any definition came strictly from the communities. There is some language in our law about some of the things that might constitute a community of interest.